take home the golden gloves, you've got to put in the work, and you've got to be tough as nails. Ashley Kalis was driven to achieve. Today, Kalis is still fueled by that same hope, grit, and determination. A mother of 3 school-aged boys and successful business owner who ran testing and vaccination sites across the state. Kalis is the fighter Rhode Island needs right now because it's time for a change. Ashley Kalis for governor.
Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those new to the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Professor Brenda Shaffer. Professor, finally welcome to see you here. She teaches at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, and she is also a senior advisor for energy at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. We'll be talking about some of the major events rocking the world today, the energy crisis, the role Turkey is playing in that, the growing role of South Caucasus, and the issues with Iran and some of these parties. Professor, welcome again. And before we begin, if you could tell us a little bit about your background to the audience. The audience is very international, and it would be great for them to learn more about what you do.
Great. Yes, so I'm currently a research professor at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School and work especially there on energy, especially the field of operational energy, which is energy for the military use, and the topic of critical energy infrastructure protection and energy security policies. I'm also a senior advisor for energy at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and also a senior fellow at the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. Last couple of years, been working on a few books. Just recently completed a book on ethnic politics in Iran that should be out in the fall, a textbook on operational energy for the military, and working now on a very new book on international energy policy in light of, really the failures of our policies in Europe, the United States, and the global energy crisis.
These are all extremely exciting ventures, and I look forward to discussing them more in detail once they come out. In the meantime, I'd like to start off the discussion by asking the question that no one is asking. We are seeing a lot being discussed in terms of the energy crisis, the various ways to overcome dependency on Russian oil and gas, what US should and should not be doing. Less discussed is how the energy crisis affects specific sectors of the economy, and certainly very little by way of military operations, and whether there has been any impact already or whether there is any to be foreseen in the near future. Given that energy is at the forefront of the war in Ukraine, I'd be very curious to hear what you think about this.
Yeah, so first thing, I think it's really important to point out that the energy crisis started way before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it's very easy just to pin it all on Russia. And then you think, well, then once that Russian-Ukraine conflict is resolved, then energy prices will go back to normal or something. But really, the invasion just added or accelerated trends that were already happening. But it's very important for us to recognize that that we've had very severe energy crises in Europe for already 2 years every winter. And the price crisis that's happened in the United States, already started about 8 months before before Russia's invasion. So on the European front, we had 2 crises in winter where there was gas shortages and very high prices. And despite this, let's say these were kind of, shorter, run-ups to this big blown crisis, right? Nobody took any action, not Brussels, not the European Union institutions, not, member countries, but it was very easy to see. I mean, their policy, they had a shortage of gas, not because of, a geopolitical actor or Russia, but simply they did everything possible to make it hard to bring especially pipeline gas, which is more affordable, into Europe. Thinking that if you deny supplies, somehow more renewables will take their place. But of course, there's limited technologies. There's limited, there's a limited ability of the current renewables to deliver the amounts of energy in a stable way that's necessary. So when you deny gas, all you end up with is using more coal and fuel oil. So they could see 2 winters in a row, this was the pattern, that when there wasn't enough heat and there wasn't gas, you saw the various utilities in Europe go over to fuel oil and to coal. And you would think, wow, we better correct this, right? But nothing happened, until this war. And then in the United States, we had, something that's affecting the United States, but also affecting the world. The main factor that set the stage for such high global oil prices right now is the fact that after COVID, all the major oil production levels came back in the world, except for the United States. So the only oil producer, major oil producer missing in action is the United States. And that sets the stage for when, you start, removing some Russian barrels, with that it's much more painful, And so President Biden likes to say, well, we were able to take Iranian barrels off the market, and it didn't really hurt the price. That's true because we had U.S. shale playing the swing producer, as Iranian barrels were taken off the market, U.S. barrels were revving up production in order to capture, some of that price hike, and they had that ability. But when basically between the government and Wall Street, we've smashed U.S. oil production, U.S. oil and gas production over the last couple of years. That's at the stage. So sure, the Western response to the invasion, the sanctions, certainly that increased the level of crisis, but Europe itself and the United States itself set the stage for this crisis.
NATO has pledged to dedicate large amounts of, or at least various countries within NATO are pledged to dedicate larger percentage of their budget towards common defense. Do you think this energy situation will have an impact, especially with Germany now seeming to back out on its obligations on both the defense front and the energy divestment front?
Right. I think, it's a very good question. We're definitely already seeing recession in parts of Europe and the UK, and I wouldn't be surprised to hear that we're already in recession in the United States, and of course it's going to affect everything from whether it's defense budgets or every ability. Really in Germany, what's something we need to think about with the energy supplies in Europe, it's not enough just to replace molecules with molecules. Like this idea that LNG, liquefied natural gas, can replace pipeline gas from Russia. It's not exactly accurate. It can replace them in the sense of sort of basic, provision of heat and power, but it can't be the base. Electricity produced by LNG cannot be the base for a competitive economy. So, you need not just security of supply, you need security of price. And certainly Europe, and especially the industrialized economies like Germany, Italy, France, they won't be able to keep up their manufacturing if they continue to have very high power prices. So it's definitely everything is going to be affected, in the economies of Europe.
Now I'm hearing some very strange things after President Biden released emergency supplies of petroleum. A lot of it apparently somehow ended up benefiting China rather than US, Europe, or anyone else. How did that happen, and why isn't it much more over scandal, really, given that the whole point was to lower the prices here?
Well, the thing is, oil is a global market. We do have a benchmark for the US, and there are times when they diverge, but because most of the US oil production is light oil, and most of US refineries refine medium to heavier grades. US needs to import oil anyways and export their lighter grades. So really we're always going to be in a situation where we're importing and exporting oil. Even if the United States is net oil exporter, it's still going to import oil because of the issues of grades and refineries and seasonality. Now, let's start with the wider decision of release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Anyone with even the most sort of basic background in the oil market could tell you that, well, one thing, legally, you're not supposed to release barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to impact price. It's really supposed to be about emergency. So first thing, there's a big question whenever a president uses this to affect price, if this is a correct use of this essentially an emergency supply volume. Second, anyone who works on oil knows that it's not going to help, because it's not just the volumes that are in the market, but what really affects price trends is the perception of potential shortage. So the minute you start taking volumes out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, you reduce a cushion in the market. So yeah, you have more volumes in the market now, but you have more chance of disruption in the future. So it never really helps, and it didn't help. And I think, yes, is it irritating that those barrels went abroad and to China? Yes, but it wouldn't have really, it's a global market. So it doesn't really matter if those barrels go to Boston or they go to Beijing. They're going to affect they're going to affect the supplies in the market in an equal manner. So I'm less disturbed by that, although of course, yeah, something about it just doesn't feel always feel right. But
so in light of these events, Europe in particular has been trying to forge stronger energy relations with other alternative suppliers, such as Azerbaijan. Can you tell us more about how this process is working, given the fact that sudden increase in demand may not immediately turn into the immediately available supply? What is this cooperation looking like at the moment, and what direction is it taking? And do you think this is more of a permanent or a temporary collaboration that we're seeing?
Right. So I think definitely the European officials are looking all around their neighborhood and trying to get in as many new gas supplies as possible and quickly as possible. And it's kind of ironic, because if you compare, let's say, Europe's potential energy security situation versus Asia's, okay, so Asia, most major Asian gas consumers, Japan, South Korea, they don't sit, or gas importers, they don't sit physically near any options of pipeline gas. So they have to use a more expensive LNG. Here you're Europe, and you sit next to all the major reservoirs of gas, the biggest reservoirs of gas in the world, and you could have multiple volumes, diversified market on pipeline, but you don't engage in it because you don't like the idea of natural gas. Somehow natural gas, I was just talking with some group of energy experts, and we were just laughing how gas used to be the solution, almost zero air pollution, low climate impact. Overnight, somehow in Europe, it became demonetized, and then also in the last year here in the United States under this administration, like gas for almost understandable reasons went from, really the fastest way to decarbonize is from coal to natural gas switching. And again, no air pollution, which it doesn't matter if what your views are on climate. Nobody likes air pollution. Everyone agrees that that's a bad thing. And yet, what we're doing is, Europe, initially Europe, and now to a certain extent the United States, we're inhibiting production of natural gas, and therefore we're ending up, like as I mentioned before, using more coal and more oil, especially in the European case. So now they're changing their policy and they're trying to find gas supplies. So I think it's kind of a mixed picture in terms of all the countries they've outreach to. Let's remember that the EU itself can't buy gas. There's no one there that can, write a check and say, okay, start producing gas. And gas itself, it takes investments and time to produce. So in some cases they can get a little bit more gas from the supplier. Some cases it will take a long time, if at all. So in the case specifically that you remembered with Azerbaijan, this probably has the best prospects for getting additional gas into Europe. Some of it in the short runs, more in the medium run, and certainly in the long run. So what's the advantage of Azerbaijan versus all the other suppliers that Europe's been looking at is that, one, there is dedicated infrastructure into Europe that's already built. There's the Southern Gas Corridor. It goes from the Caspian Sea, from Azerbaijan through Georgia, Turkey, Albania, Greece, and Italy. So that pipeline exists. It doesn't have to wait for any permits, for any agreements, investors. It exists, and it was built as a scalable project, as a project that's easily able to rev it up with a lot more, with double the volumes. So with some sort of not huge investments, the infrastructure itself can transit more gas. That gas, some of it can come from other neighbors of Azerbaijan, like Turkmenistan, like we're seeing right now, gas volumes that are being transited via Iran, from Turkmenistan via Iran into Turkey, and that's able to get a little bit more gas into Europe that way, or by accelerating production plans in Azerbaijan. And I think that's what they're doing now. That, for instance, right now, the major export to Europe from Azerbaijan, it's from a field called Shaffer, but from stage 2, I believe they're accelerating stage 3 and 4. They're accelerating the development of other fields that were, they were under development. They had investments made in them, but they're really sort of working around the clock to get that gas to market a lot faster, like the Afsharon field. So I think those things will definitely happen. I think one question where people, on the policy side want to do something is that over the last years, most international public financing has stopped financing any fossil fuel projects. So if you're in Ghana or you're in Tanzania and you want to develop your gas, you can only, get investments from the commercial market and not from public finance, which is usually easier for developing countries to access. And it's something I think it's just quite immoral, to say, okay, Africa, you're not going to get loans and have nice, clean natural gas. You're just going to have no electricity and, and not have energy development. But so it seems that, if you look at the memorandum of understanding signed between the European Union and Azerbaijan, there is a lot of mentioning of public finance, and the EU has the EIB and the RBD. They have public finance banks that up until now had stepped away from fossil fuels, including natural gas. I think that if Brussels really pushes the public finance banks to make loans for these projects, they can get gas even faster. But so something even concretely, Bulgaria, one of the most vulnerable countries in Europe in terms of security of supply, basically all of its gas comes from Russia, but it's altogether, it's only 3 BCM, and now it's going to be getting about a BCM from Azerbaijan. So having that one secure, it's a third, but having, one secure source of gas, that'll make a big difference. And the point is, moving forward, it's possible to use Russian gas in a secure way. You know, this idea that, well, let's say, that we shouldn't buy any Russian gas, right? It's not secure. They'll use the gas weapon, right? Well, they'll only use the gas weapon if it could be effective, in a sense that there's no ample storage. There's no diverse supplies in a market. I mean, European allowed itself, it's like you have a house full of a lot of nice goods, and you don't put a lock on, you don't put an alarm on, and you let all the people in the neighborhood know that you have no locks, no alarms, and not even a big dog, right? Well, I'm not blaming the victim, but don't be surprised, if there's a crime, if there's a burglar in your house, right? So Europe basically set itself up for this vulnerability to Russia. More diversified markets, don't have this kind of vulnerability. I mean, compare, for instance, with Turkey, which is also a very important export market for Russia. Because it's a diversified market, it has supplies from Azerbaijan, it has supplies from Iran, it has a lot of LNG facilities, it has very good storage. Even during the crisis in Turkish-Russian relations, after the downing of a Russian plane over Syria, when Russia stopped the tourism, stopped importing fruits and vegetables, produce from Turkey, it didn't stop the gas flows, meaning that it knew there it really didn't have a weapon because Turkey had alternatives. So why give up the revenue? So I think even in the future there can be secure imports of Russian gas into Europe, as long as it's used wisely, and you observe the rules of energy security, which one of the most basic ones is diversification of sources, diversification, a diverse fuel mix, and storage and redundancy of infrastructure.
Speaking of which, Azerbaijan itself has also been looking to diversify both its economy in general from dependency on energy, but also looking to develop green energy renewables, perhaps jointly with the European Union. How is this current situation impacting these decisions?
Right. So, there's already been even prior to this signing of the memorandum of understanding with Europe, Azerbaijan signed contracts to commission wind and solar in the liberated territories, and also offshore wind. And I think that this is also interconnected to the supplies that can make it to Europe, because Azerbaijan has very good potential for both wind and solar. So probably it will be able to displace about 2 or 3 BCM of gas that are today consumed by the domestic market by this wind and solar. And this would mean within 2 to 3 years, this gas could already arrive in Europe, because wind and solar projects tend to be established a lot quicker than natural gas projects. So I think that's going to be, and definitely they've decided, the president of Azerbaijan has decided that the liberated territories will be a green zone. So they're really trying to make it mostly on renewable energy, more small renewable energy that won't have high impact on the environment, to keep this a real green zone. And I think they're already looking at solar energy in Zangilan near the border with Iran, which has high potential for solar.
These economic and energy opportunities are also having an impact on Azerbaijan's efforts to integrate the South Caucasus following the Second Karabakh War. Do you see an increased potential for collaboration in that regard? There's also been competing talks about provocations from the Armenian side, whether or not other external parties are involved on that, and whether that's a threat to energy supply in the future, just as before the start of the Second Karabakh War, the energy supplies were targeted. Do you see that happening again?
Right. So the full-scale war between Azerbaijan and Armenia erupted in 27th of September 2020. But actually, as you mentioned, July 12th, there was already Armenian attacks about 300 kilometers north of the Karabakh area, where the forces didn't regularly engage in the Tavuz region. And there was an Armenian attempt to take the hills above the southern gas corridor the whole energy and transport corridor, which includes the BTC pipeline, the southern gas corridor, and major roads and rail. And it's really one of the only, this is what our colleague Luke Kofi termed the Ganja Gap, one of the only roads that doesn't go, or transit roads and energy roads that doesn't go through Russia or Iran, in the greater region. So it's a very strategic area. And it was clear that Armenia was aiming to get the hills above the pipeline, because they even published photos of their troops, there, and as if they captured it. It was clear that something was prepared ahead of time, to focus on those hills. So it seems there was a clear Armenian interest to try to disrupt these gas supplies to Europe, or at least to devalue them, in the sense that investors would fear expanding the supplies, adding the supplies. Probably, let's recall that Armenia hosts 3 Russian military bases today. Its air defense is run by Russia. If you fly a plane from Europe over Armenia, into Asia, it's a Russian air control officer that speaks with you. So probably Armenia was acting in cooperation or at the behest of Russia, that obviously was not that interested in new, alternative gas supplies entering Europe. Now it's very interesting post-war. Part of the post-war ceasefire agreement included opening up of communications and transportation, between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And actually, Azerbaijan is pushing for this most, that it really wants to, in a sense, lock Armenia into peace. Once, transportation is open and borders open with Azerbaijan, with Turkey, it would be very difficult probably for a political leader to say, hey, let's go back to and start preparing for war. Also the psychological impact for their own people once they start interacting again with Azerbaijan and Turkey and trading and see the benefits of the peace. The hope is that this will alleviate any sort of aspirations to return to war. But Armenia, which could benefit most, would most benefit from these infrastructures, has been kind of hesitant, delaying. It's already been 2 years since the war, almost 2 years, and it's not opened up to these infrastructure, has not completely agreed to open up this infrastructure, but it could allow also a lot of energy trade, and this again could benefit Armenia immensely. Armenia is pretty much reliant on a aging nuclear reactor, which has no secondary container. It's not a containment shield. It's not the same type of reactor as Chernobyl, but it shares with 4 other reactors in the world, that it has no secondary containment shield like Chernobyl had. So it's a huge danger to the region, but it's a huge danger to the people of Armenia. It'd be so much better if it had access to natural gas. Even coal-fired plant would be much better for Armenia, than this really, really dangerous nuclear reactor there. Also, we just hear in the last couple of days, Iran is accelerating its opposition to the establishment of this infrastructure, these roads. They want to keep Armenia dependent on Iran. They want to keep Armenia as an important area where they can circumvent sanctions, where they can, Iran used the occupied territories for drug trade, for other illicit activity. Many tunnels were found after the war that Iran used, just to directly enter the occupied territories, and probably with drug runners and other illicit activity. But even seen explicitly, even Khamenei this week said I'm very happy Karabakh went back to Azerbaijan. I don't want to see anything that would cut the border between Armenia and Iran. No one's talking about cutting the border between Armenia and Iran, but what he means is that there shouldn't be any of these roads and trade and energy links, which might actually sort of turn this trade into, to more of a legal zone, more transparent zone, and not something where Iran can just run drug runners as it pleases.
Could it be that Iran is actually behind this, the slowdown in the discussions of the opening of the Zangezur corridor, and behind some of the recent provocations and tensions? We've seen that last year, Iran was quite openly provocative. The two countries nearly came to very significant tensions, if not outright conflicts. The excuse at that time was alleged defense relationships with Israel, which are also nothing new. They've been there for quite some time. Now we're seeing that Azerbaijan is also putting pressure on Iran from an energy standpoint as an alternative to Iran's own supplies to Europe. What do you think? Do you think there's going to be an even greater acceleration in these tensions as a result?
Right. So, as you pointed out, I mean, Iran is in opposition to Armenia joining these, joining this infrastructure, even though it could help Armenia, but it would lessen dependence on Iran and would give Iran less freedom of movement, especially for illicit activity. So yes, I agree with you that Iran is probably putting pressure on Armenia, or at least encouraging Armenia, not to give in and agree to joining this infrastructure. It's a very important point also about Israel, which many people think that because of Azerbaijan's close relations with Israel, this is the reason that Iran is always in opposition of Azerbaijan and supporting Armenia. The timeline is simply not true, as I'm sure you know well. Iran from day one was against Azerbaijan, and the first war, Armenia-Azerbaijan war, supported Armenia. There's no territorial continuity between Russia and Armenia. They don't share a border. So supplies to Armenia during the first war and then this second war in 2020, Russian supplies to its ally Armenia had to go through other countries. And so Iran was the main transit state in both wars of all the arms to Armenia from Russia. There were regular, in this last war, there were regular boats that would arrive, from the Russian Caspian ports to the Iranian port of Anzali, and trucks would take it from Anzali, directly into Armenia. And ethnic Azerbaijanis that live in Iran, they actually, they saw these trucks. Some of them work at the port. One of them, actually, the contractor that had the contract for these trucks, he's an ethnic Azerbaijani, and even, gave interviews about, we're moving, this equipment. We have the supply contract. So it's no question that Iran is a conduit of the arms to Armenia. And in the early days, also, the Armenians were constantly thanking Iran for its help during the war. You are a lifeline, you are food security. I mean, because they were praising Iran so much, it's not really something that's debatable. So Iran opposed Azerbaijan's independence and wanted to keep it bogged down in war, simply because it fears if Azerbaijan is an attractive country, it could lead to rise in nationalism among the Azerbaijanis in Iran. Azerbaijanis in Iran are a third of the population of Iran, and most of them live in areas that border Azerbaijan itself, and so they could look over the border, and see Azerbaijan and visit and have trade and family visits and tourism and all these things. And in the last couple of years, I think there's been really a rising problem, or fear from Tehran, but probably a grounded fear that the ethnic Azerbaijanis in Iran want the change of regime. They want their language rights. I think the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, it really had a huge impact on the self-identification of Azerbaijanis in Iran, because they could look thousands, more than tens of thousands, maybe up to hundreds of thousands, went to the border area. They could see, they could see the battles taking place, right? They could see the soldiers. There's a lot of films and there's a lot of evidence from soldiers who participated, with Iranian Azerbaijanis cheering them on and seeing. I mean, if you like let's say even if you saw, a group of Jews that were fighting and being shot at, and you knew that your country was helping the people, the country you live in was helping the people, kill your co-ethnics, it would, it's a very difficult thing. So I think this was a real watershed for identity of Azerbaijanis. And, you see it, yesterday, the Iranian ambassador in Baku, he made a death threat to Ambassador George Deek in Israel, because Ambassador Deek showed a picture of himself reading a book about Azerbaijani culture in Tabriz, which is the main city populated by ethnic Azerbaijanis in Iran. Book wasn't about irredentism, it wasn't about geopolitics, it made no claim on Iranian territory. It was simply a book about culture. He just took a picture of himself reading this book, saying he's taking an interest in this group. It would be like if I said I'm reading a book about Jews in Warsaw. It's nothing political, or Jewish culture in Warsaw. Nothing political about that. Jewish culture in London, right? And the Iranian ambassador, and then after authorities in Tehran, threatened his life for just reading a book about Azerbaijani culture. So you see that this is a very sensitive issue to them, and you ask why, if they feel so confident in their rule there, and they feel so confident that the people love Tehran's policies and identify with the government, they wouldn't be so sensitive to a foreign ambassador reading a book about culture of the group. So you have to ask the question, why are they so sensitive to any questions, any discussion of the ethnic minorities in Iran?
And that also might be, I'm interested how given that Azerbaijanis are Turkic in origin, given Iran's very complicated relationship with Turkey, we are seeing some of this play out. Turkey has been trying to rebuild the relations with Israel, with Gulf states. It has particular energy needs. At the same time, it's had relations with Iran, particularly with respect to certain Kurdish-related issues. Now there was a shutdown of a terrorist operation in Turkey, with the Turkey and Israeli intelligence cooperating against Iranian efforts on the Israelis. And we've seen a visit of Erdogan, Putin, and to Tehran just this week. What is happening? What role is Turkey playing in these international events? And where do we see it vis-a-vis Iran specifically, given its own complex geopolitical interests?
Right. Well, both Turks and Iranian officials, whenever they're at, or even just people in general, when they're asked about their relations, they always say that Turkey and Iran, have a border that for 400 years hasn't changed. It's one of the longest stable, borders in the world. And why does that work? It works because, and if you, with the different events you're saying, like on one hand, they're fighting here, and this, they're cooperating, right? Their relations are really set by realpolitik on both sides. So they recognize that they're neighbors. This is a fact of geography. And it's better not to be at war. On the other hand, on other, and where they can cooperate, they should cooperate, but on other issues they completely disagree. And I think that's why it's very difficult to understand Turkish-Iranian relations, and also that most people kind of look for some kind of ideological or religious character, but most religion and ethnicity has very little impact on, I believe, on choosing alliances and foreign policy choices. Like, take for instance, Ukraine and Russia both share a common Orthodox church. They share a common origin, in a sense, history, right? It's only very, very modern that they start to see themselves as separate, nations, and maybe only significantly after the break of the Soviet Union, and maybe only significantly from 2014 was a real total evolution of seeing themselves as two different peoples. I think that, or Georgia and Ukraine as well, share Orthodox faith, and it sure doesn't help them in political relations. On the other hand, Iran claims to be the protectorate of all Shia, fight for justice for Muslims, and it has no problem supporting Armenia in a war in which it kicked 1 million Shia out of their homes and then destroyed every home, destroyed mosques. Armenia destroyed, put pigs in mosques, destroyed Muslim cemeteries, right? So I don't think there's much in most foreign relations, but even highly in Iranian foreign policy, is there much of an aspect of ideology or religion, despite its rhetoric. So that's why I think you see a lot of these zigzags. They try to keep it from ever, escalating to all-out conflict. They try to keep the trade up where they can, but sometimes especially in their security relations, security situation, their interests deviate to different directions.
We are seeing that there's a lot of discussion about Turkey's interest in balancing various relations before the upcoming elections next year, between NATO and Russia, between being seen as a reliable neighbor and patching relations with Israel, with the Arab states and so forth, but at the same time still pursuing nationalist interests regarding Cyprus, regarding its intense relationship with Greece. We're seeing a lot of this going on, but what do you think will happen after the elections, after next year?
Yeah, so I don't agree with that the elections is the watershed. I think many analysts are saying this because they want to say that it's not sincere or it's not strategic, and that it's just sort of being done to sort of stabilize the economy and the security situation before the election. I think this is a process. I think it depends on the specific relations, but I think it's a process that began way before before this year or the year before, and certainly even with Israel from the around 2016, there's also an effort to open a new chapter. So yeah, I don't think the elections is the focal point. I think there's many issues. Many people who try to look at Turkey, they put everything on President Erdogan as if that's the all the decisions and all the behavior. So I would say two things. First thing, it's a much more complex political system than there's it's a wider wide coalition, and that's one thing. And second, many of the issues that are in conflict with the West are not issues that are just something that Erdogan supports, but if someone else came new, he would change the policies. Like, let's say American support for YPG, for the PKK offshoot in Syria. You won't find really any Turk that thinks that that's a legitimate policy, that a NATO member and a close ally of Turkey, the United States, supports a group which has conducted many terrorist operations and killed hundreds of Turkish citizens. And it's kind of like a mirror image, just like Israel demands that Turkey not allow Hamas to operate from its territory as a precondition to improve relations. At the same time, Turkey, it's telling the same thing to Sweden, and it's telling the same thing to the United States. If you have strategic, military cooperation with a terrorist group that conducts operations against Turkey, in the case of Sweden, this will be an obstacle to NATO. In the case of the United States, that this is an obstacle for us being, good allies, right? So I think there's or delimitation between Greece and Turkey. These conflicts have been going on for 1,000 years. They'll go on for another 1,000 years. And it's not an issue connected to President Erdogan's views. It's all Turks share these views. But I would say that as maybe a message to the United States on the maritime issues, that the goal of a superpower is not only to work against your adversaries, it's actually to coordinate and control your allies. And it doesn't really make sense, like when the US Congress tries to, support Greece's position in the delimitation. What the United States should do is make sure that they're not fighting over this, that there isn't an active conflict, because right now, what the United States needs, basically the whole Eastern Mediterranean basin, it's almost all US allies. And it's really really a loss, that they would be in conflict with each other instead of actually being in cooperation with each other. That would better serve U.S. national interest.
Do you think U.S. could be playing a greater diplomatic role in resolution of these issues, whether it's with Greece or with any other groups? I mean, for instance,
I think with Greece and Turkey, the best thing the United States needs to request to coerce both sides not to be in conflict. And I think the members of Congress that are supporting sort of an aggressive a change of status quo from the Greek side, I think that's very very irresponsible. Again, American policymakers, whether in Congress and the executive, should be supporting that. Hey, we don't have you shouldn't be in conflict. But some of it should be not necessarily by resolving these conflicts. I think like the maritime disputes between Greece and Turkey really can't be ever fully, when you have so many islands and close to major territory, it can't be really fully.
I want to push back on this a little bit. I understand that the geopolitical aspects of it may not necessarily be fully resolvable, and they can go and be relitigated forever. But at the same time, a leader or a party or a government can choose to play up or not to play up those particular issues. And I'm wondering why it's ever really necessary to do that, whether there is, in fact, a populist element responsive to economic needs to kind of distract from internal issues towards the resolution of these eternal disputes that are probably best left at the back burner or resolved very quietly.
I think it's a lot less about Ankara and Athens, and unfortunately a lot more about Washington with U.S. Congress. That I think that diasporas, and I'll need to close unfortunately very soon, but that the diasporas in this wider region we talked about today, whether it's the Armenian American diaspora, the Greek diaspora, they're much more extreme on these issues than the people that actually live in the region. So it's very easy when you live in Glendale to say, yeah, go to war, yeah, and then it's not your children that will have to go to war, or your children that will have to live in in poverty. So I think it's actually in many ways, like the Greek American diaspora is actually looking more for a conflict with Turkey than Athens it is itself. I visited recently a NATO center in Istanbul, where the commander was a Turkish officer, and maritime security was a Turkish officer, and his deputy was a Greek officer, and they have a corresponding NATO center in Crete with a Greek officer commanding and a Turkish officer, his deputy. And it was amazing the way they described the center, the lack of conflict between the countries, versus if you went to the U.S. Congress, I think you'd hear a very different story.
So perhaps it would be best for all if U.S., instead of trying to stick to any specific individual fights, had more of a general and better diplomatic involvement and perhaps understanding of these issues, and could play a more constructive rather than exacerbating our instigatory role. But in general, I think from all of this, we can use more U.S. leadership in general, a stronger, better, and more thoughtful U.S. leadership on many questions, ranging from diplomacy to energy and energy security. I think this also will not be resolved in one day, but hopefully we can take lessons from the mistakes that's already been made and hopefully make better decisions in the future. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for this fascinating, thought-provoking discussion, and I definitely learned a lot. I think there's a lot of questions to continue to discuss in the future, and I hope we'll see you many more times on this platform.
Okay, thank you, Irina. Thank you for the interview. Your questions were very interesting, and thank you to our audience.
And of course, I look forward to reading your books once they come out.
Thank you so much.
For everyone who stayed till the end, this was the Washington Outsider Report. With us was Professor Brenda Shaffer. And stay tuned for our next program, Tuesday night, 9 p.m.